So I'm Dan Riley. I'm an OBGYN, and I work in Fergus, Ontario, which is rural Ontario. It's not small enough for me, so one day a week I go up to Palmerston, which is Palmerston if you're from there. It has a different inflection when you go to even really small places. Fergus is about 20,000 people. Palmerston is small enough to not have a population on the sign. So some of you know that size community where you come in and it's welcome to, but there's no population anywhere because nobody's counted. I work at MAC. I teach ethics at MAC, and that I'm married. My son is about to go off to high school or to university, so that's the life stage I'm at, and that's me. We'll carry on.
Okay. My name is François Bourassa. I'm a doctor in Montreal. I work in two different places. One is a rehab hospital. So it's patients that are post-op, post-stroke, all sorts of different problems, sometimes organ transplant. So it's a rather active at times because they get to you and they're not exactly stable yet. And also I work in a long-term care facility. So I have also patients that have been living for a long time or have just arrived in a new home where they didn't really have a choice as to going there. So it gives it's a different approach. So it's something I enjoy to do. Also, I'm married. My wife is here as well. And she's in medicine as well, something that wasn't my plan initially, but we ended up choosing each other. So that's about it for me.
I'm Paul Zung. I'm a dentist spent most of my career at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, where we look after severely, chronically, mentally ill people and people with addictions. I have an interest in the interface between psychology and theology, the resonances and the conflicts between them. I'm married with one wife and 4 adult children, a dog and a rabbit, and the conflicts between them.
I'm Michelle Corvermaker. I am a doctor in Woodstock, Ontario mostly, and I also work in a smaller town called Wingham, which is about an hour from Palmerston, and I have friends who live in Palmerston actually too. So in any event, I essentially work part-time in the Woodstock Emerge. I do palliative care locums in Woodstock. There's a hospice in Woodstock. And I do family medicine locums in Wingham. And if I'm not doing a locum, sometimes I'm just doing emerge shifts there, and we do 24-hour emerge shifts there. But we usually get sleep, so it's not as bad as it sounds. I'm not married, but I have 4 nephews and 3 nieces, and I very much enjoy them. And that's why I'm living in Ontario, because I need to know them. So I want to be closer to where they live. So.
Cool. So first question, number 2 was aimed at me, so I'll answer that. Where is your normal retreat sweater? I didn't know I had a normal retreat sweater, but I'll be wearing a different sweater tomorrow, so that might be the normal retreat sweater. We'll see. So this is the question for the panel. What part of living your faith out in the context of medicine is most difficult for you?
I can start with that one. I guess I was saying that to someone earlier today, that when you're dealing with mental health issues, there's times that when you actually take the history, you think, wow, these people really, they just need to know the Lord, and then they can deal with some of the issues that they're dealing with. Some of it's not that they're dealing with schizophrenia, they're depressed because they're holding on to bitterness about something that happened long ago, and they just haven't been able to forgive someone or whatever in that regard. And you just think, wow, there would be so much hope for you if you could deal with this biblically. But you're kind of stuck because in that public setting, when you don't have a relationship with someone, like you can't just say, well, you need to know Jesus and that's it. And that doesn't work. You have to, there has to be a relationship, and it's not really the context where you're in to be able to go into the gospel. So sometimes it's easier dealing with people with things like depression or anxiety when you have a common faith versus when you don't. So.
Well, all of my patients have serious mental health problems or addictions, as I said. Dentists actually tend to see the same patients for extended periods of times, and they stay with them for years, so we get to know them. I think one of the most difficult things for me is the emotional struggle. I know what it would require for that person to come to faith, and my need to share with that person faith, but the relationship has to develop to a point where we can trust each other to say certain things. And just the sheer number of life issues that need to be worked through, the amount of caring that I would have to provide to each one to be within the relational range to make the sharing of the gospel comfortable and natural. It seems overwhelming. There are a couple of people with whom I can share very easily, but many others I know that I never can and will be in a position to. And I have to trust God will extend His grace some other way.
Well, I find that in a hospital situation, sometimes when a patient brings it up, then it's something that's much easier to discuss, but otherwise, it's not something that I feel comfortable bringing up because I don't know how they'll take it, and you're trying to establish a relationship with the patient to help them through what they're living. And it's like in introducing humor, introducing some humanity to it, giving them time to try to resolve some of their problems. You have to be careful in your approach, and I'm not completely comfortable always trying to integrate that because the timing of it can be difficult because the patients, like you said, you don't know them necessarily that well. And also when you have a lot of patients, for instance, long-term care, a lot of patients are demented. So I could have all the conversations I want 5 minutes later. It's not something that you can really work on with them either in that situation. So it varies on the context of work, and you have to have a certain comfort level, but the relationship with your patient is very important. The ones that I was able to discuss this with were generally those who brought it up or were facing a possible end-of-life situation. So palliative care I found was a little more appropriate in that situation because it was one where they were more comfortable bringing it to me. And patients that I've met that had cancers that were terminal, they tended to want to talk to me more about this because they're having all of those questions about life and what to do, what to expect. Whereas other people just had a hip replacement, they just want to go home. So they don't necessarily want to have a philosophical discussion on religion, but it's good to get them to laugh a bit because they're depressed in the hospital. But they don't necessarily want to go into religion and other things like that. So I find it kind of difficult in my practice sometimes to integrate it.
So being a consultant who does episodic care, it almost never comes up. Faith issues never come up in my line of work. There's a joke in gynecology that you go into gynecology because you can't stand taking somebody through anything longer than 9 months, right? That's why you do gynecology. The challenge in living out my faith, I think it's the people I see myself having the most impact on are my colleagues. Right, so I don't have ongoing relationship with patients generally. They tend to come with a problem, I fix the problem. The problem very seldom lends itself to any kind of faith discussion, and then they carry on with their lives. The people I'm going to be hanging with for 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years is my colleagues, physicians and nurses. And in a small community, in a small place, we get to know each other, warts and all, right? And so I'm very conscious of how everybody knows that I'm a Christian and I have this funny faith thing that a lot of them don't really understand, and I'm aware of how I'm being observed and how I'm representing Christ in the place where I work. And that's a tremendous privilege, but also a tremendous responsibility, which I can keep giving back to God and trust that God's going to give me what I need today to be him in that space. And so that I think is the challenge I'm always aware of, is these, and these are people that I hang out with at 3 o'clock in the morning when none of us want to be there and everybody's cranky, right? And there's such a tendency to black humor in the OR at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's so easy to slip into the not representing Christ well, but at the same time, I know that everybody watches me represent Christ. So that's the challenge. I don't know if you guys want to give quick answers or short answers to this, or leave this to me, because it's what I get asked a lot at these sort of sessions. What are your opinions regarding premarital sex? Are those participating in it not Christian or not as Christian? So I have a well worked out answer in my brain because I've been doing this for 15 years, but I don't know if any of you guys want to jump in on that.
Doing premarital sex?
So I've been married for 20 years this summer. So
It's okay after
yeah,
you're married.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. When it's not by definition, it's one of those self-refuting statements, right? Like you can't have premarital sex with your wife. Self-refuting statement.
I guess I would respond to that the Bible is clear that sex within marriage is what God condones, and any other sex is not what God condones. So it's a simple answer, but that's where God blesses it, and it's not blessed outside of that.
But in that sense, would you be saying that it's we can't necessarily say they're not Christian, but it's a sin within Christianity?
Well, it's a sin, whether you're a Christian or not.
Yeah, but
Right?
but still, it doesn't mean that they're not Christian. It just means
I
it's
didn't.
a sin.
No, I'm saying it's
I
just
think
like
that the question was.
some
The
people.
question, are they not as Christian? That
Well,
was the
if you
question.
believe in Jesus as your Savior and Lord, and that you claim him, like you believe that, then you're probably not having him as Lord as you should, but you're still a Christian because you don't earn your salvation. Your salvation is a gift. And lots of people need to come to that point of being convicted of how they should be living for Christ. And there are things that we all do that we justify, whether it's as intimate of sin, but it's still, it doesn't make you a Christian or not a Christian to have premarital sex. So
It's just one thing I wanted to point out. It's something that you shouldn't do, that actually costs a bit to the relationship you will have with the person you marry, because it will no longer be something sacred and special you share with that person. It'll be something you've shared with many other people, which will make it something that is less of a glue within your relationship. Because then, what happens, one of the big causes of relationship breakups is when you start having either physical or emotional sharing outside of the relationship with someone of the opposite sex. If you're comfortable, if I were comfortable speaking to a girl about things that are very personal more than my wife, and if I were speaking to her about personal things, that would probably not necessarily be appropriate, because it would be creating a potential for the development of a relationship that could lead to problems within my relationship with my wife. It would be sharing something that should be specific to the marital relationship. Whereas if I agree with my wife that, okay, this person is someone that we can go to and we can talk about when we have difficulties and we don't feel comfortable talking to each other, just to help us deal with things, like if it's a family member, if it's someone that we all trust, that's one thing. But to go outside of the relationship and exclude someone and do things with someone else that has nothing to do with your husband or wife, that is something that can be problematic.
And I think I would echo that if we're all honest with ourselves, there are things in our lives that we do often that the Holy Spirit is convicting us about, that we ought to work on. And that doesn't make you any less a Christian. Some of those things are obvious for other people looking in at you to see, and some of them are not. And premarital sex would probably be one that anyone who knows you can figure out what's going on. So I would echo everything that's said here. Because this is perhaps a more sophisticated crowd than your high school crowd, I would speculate that actually one can't have premarital sex in the biblical sense, because in the biblical sense, once one has had sex, God has joined you together. And therefore, you are married. All one can do is have adulterous sex after that first relationship where you had the sex that made you married. Which sort of turns the whole thing around a bit. And that what the church says is that if God's joined you together, why haven't you wrapped it up in covenant? Because this is a dangerous commitment you have made if you haven't wrapped it up in covenant. So certainly if a young couple comes to me and says, we've become Christians and we've been living common law for a couple of years, what should we do about that? My answer would be that you have been joined together. Given that you are now Christian, we think that it is best, and God would instruct you to wrap that up in covenant. And we do that through marriage. So let's get that done tonight. And I certainly worry about, our society has separated out sex from marriage, right? And has pulled these two things apart. And I wonder if actually, and if the church in some sense has gone along with that by allowing people to talk about premarital sex as something wrong. Because again, I've spent a lot of time, as you read scripture and look at how sex functions, sex joins together, right? And so I wonder, to the Old Testament scholar, or the person living in the Old Testament, or even in the New Testament, the concept of premarital sex would have been foreign to them. Marital unfaithfulness, that's been around forever, right? But if you've had sex, then you're joined together, and we as a society should do some sort of public acknowledgement that God has joined you together. Oh, you don't want to do that public acknowledgement? Well, then you've just chosen to tear apart what God has joined together. That's the dangerous thing, right? And that's the damaging thing. But you need somebody with a certain level of intelligence to take the conversation there. If you were all teenagers, I would say, this is something God designed to join you together. And when you are reaching a point where there's emotional intimacy, physical intimacy will naturally follow. And so it's time to go ring shopping. And we as a church need to make it really easy to get married and really hard to get unmarried. Instead, and I always am really worried when I hear parents of teenagers in my church talking about the kind of wedding that they expect their kid to have and the kind of education they expect their kid to have before they have the wedding that they expect their kid to have. And it's very clear that they are expecting their child to get married in their mid-20s. And yet, when I hang out in the youth group, I realize that, they're 17 and they're getting pretty close emotionally with somebody else. And so either they're going to learn how to kill in themselves the physical attraction that goes with emotional attraction for 7 or 8 years, which I don't think is terribly healthy, or they're not, right? And they're going to be married, although we haven't done anything to wrap that up in a covenantal ceremony. But as you read through Scripture, the warning is not, don't have sex before you get married, right? The warning is, can anyone quote the warning that's in Genesis and Jesus repeats it? Don't, what God has joined together, let no man separate, right? So the danger in Scripture seems to be about the coming apart, not the coming together. Having said that, I think we, as Christians, we understand the world is fallen and sinful, and Paul makes it very clear that as all these people were coming into the church who were in a variety of interesting situations in terms of marriages and previous marriages and number of wives and all sorts of other things, Paul, the principle in the New Testament seems to be the state you come into Christianity in is probably the state you should stay in, with a few pastoral suggestions around that. Yeah. Paul's principle seems to be that, right? That if you're married to an unbeliever and they want to divorce you, then let the divorce happen. If you're married and they want to stay married, if you're unmarried as you become a Christian, best to stay that way. But if you really have trouble staying unmarried, then go ahead and get married. But if you're married, you should stay married. You shouldn't divorce, right? This gets really complicated if you do work in Africa and people come to your church and he's got 6 wives. And it's been interesting to watch the theologians and pastors hash that out. But none of you are in that situation, so I presume that none of you are either counseling people in that situation or in that situation yourself. So there you go. What do you think about the legalization of medical marijuana? It's a question not in my area of expertise.
It's somewhat in my area of expertise, though, because I work with patients that have all kinds of pain. And you have to understand that there's medical marijuana, but there's also forms like Cisamet, which is a cannabinoid, which is a pill. So you have cannabinoids that can be forms that won't necessarily give you the high, but can give you the pain relief. And actually now, for neuropathic pain, it's considered second line. I've had patients where, in one case, the patient had heart failure. So you can't give them anti-inflammatories because it can cause them to retain sodium and go into pulmonary edema. You can't give them opiate because he's allergic to it. Lyrica and gabapentin were tried and it doesn't relieve the pain. So if I can't relieve the pain and he's going to be bedridden, what can I do to help him in rehab? He's supposed to be able to get up and go home. So I tried Cisamet. I started the pill with him, and he was able to get up out of bed. He was able to start walking again, and he was able to function. So the thing is that we seem to have a fear of these products because of the connotation of abuse in certain circumstances. But everything can be abused in one way or another. It's to try to find out, okay, when can I use these intelligently? When do I not have a choice? When do I go through all the different possibilities and realize, okay, I don't have another choice. Let's see at least if this works before I leave this person miserable for the rest of their life. So it's an option, and it shouldn't be ignored, but it shouldn't be used for abuse. It should be used in particular situations.
I have been asked once so far about prescribing medical marijuana that you smoke, but in an emergency department it doesn't make sense, even apart from and the person hadn't exhausted their possibilities. I have prescribed it in the form of pill, and I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with the smoking part, because I wouldn't prescribe nicotine for someone to smoke because of the effects on their lungs and such. So it's hard for me to get my brain around prescribing something that someone would smoke and potentially harm themselves this way. And the other is that there's different studies which speak about how people are more prone to psychotic episodes if they were to smoke marijuana. So I have a problem with potentially sending someone down that sort of road. So I'm not comfortable with it. I have to do some more reading about it. Because you do need to educate yourself, but I don't plan to make that part of my practice. But again, I would be fine with the pill form because I don't think that would harm if it's not.
No, you don't have the lung damage. You don't.
Certainly, and not the psychosis.
Yeah. Well, the psychosis, because there's certain research that shows in young men in particular that have a certain genetic trait, it can switch off schizophrenia that you're stuck with for the rest of your life. Switch on. Sorry. And so in that case, usually the patients that I'm treating with this, they're not young adults. They're usually people who've had multiple surgeries, have multiple health issues. And so it's not at all the same context as a 20-year-old saying, hey, could you write me a prescription for pot because I enjoy it. I don't think that's ethical. I don't think it's appropriate, especially when you know about how it does burn the inside of your lungs, your respiratory system, and puts you at risk for all sorts of other issues that if you want to discuss, we can discuss later, but I think it'd be a little too long for this panel right now.
And again, I'll have to be very succinct in my answer to this one. I'll answer the second question first. When can Larry retire? Whenever he feels the Lord leading him in that direction. Number one, Dan. Are there any birth control methods that have mechanisms that you are ethically not okay with, i.e. that you think may be abortificant, and do not prescribe? What about Plan B? So in 2 minutes or less, everybody draws a line, so everybody decides where they're at ethically with contraception. And that will involve drawing a line somewhere and accepting a certain level of risk that what you're doing may inadvertently go over that line. So in Catholicism, God created physical intimacy between a man and a woman to have a relational and a reproductive aspect. And breaking anything which breaks the reproductive and relational aspects of intercourse is contravening God's will for what that experience was, and therefore damages that experience and damages us. And my understanding is that about 90% of Catholic theologians would concur with that, and about 10% have other lines of argument. So for Catholics who follow the theology of the Catholic Church, which is far better worked out than anything in Orthodoxy or Protestantism, and hence I draw a lot from it because they've written really intelligent things that Orthodox and Protestant Christians haven't worked out yet. How the mechanism of action of contraception doesn't actually matter. What matters is that you're breaking the relational and reproductive aspects by that method. Since natural family planning maintains the relational and reproductive aspects of physical intimacy, it's okay with the theology. Other methods which break that are not okay. And so you don't have to worry about how it works. What you're looking at is what it does in terms of those two aspects. So the Catholics don't have to worry about ensoulment and all the funny things that Protestants get all worked up about. If you've decided that contraception is permissible as long as it doesn't interfere after egg meets sperm, so that's where you've drawn your line, then according to the medical literature as it currently exists, Plan B is fine. There is no evidence, and there's really good evidence. So there's no evidence that Plan B has any effect after egg meets sperm. And actually fairly good evidence that it doesn't have any effect after egg meets sperm. The birth control pill is fine. There is really good evidence that the birth control pill has no effects after egg meets sperm. And again, if you're interested in the literature, I'm happy to spend an hour this evening going through the evidence with you. But for the moment, take my word for it. Barrier contraception is fine, right? Condoms have no effect after egg meets sperm. Right, and I don't need to give you evidence on that. You've got biology for that. All the barrier methods are fine. IUDs, progesterone-containing IUDs and copper-containing IUDs, their primary mechanism of action, 98, 99% of their mechanism of action is as a barrier method, preventing sperm from meeting egg. But a small degree of their efficacy, 1%, 0.5%, is in their ability to prevent a fertilized egg from implanting. So if you've drawn your line at egg meets sperm and you're unwilling to tolerate a tiny risk of interfering after egg meets sperm, then IUDs are out. Now, you can't call them an abortifacient because that's a medical term which has a medical definition. Abortificants cause an implanted pregnancy to miscarry. That's when you look it up in the medical, that's what it is. So I would not call them abortificants because that's a medical term. But they do have the potential to interfere after egg meets sperm. Placing an IUD postcoitally is done with the express intention of preventing a fertilized egg from implanting. Right? So then there's not a tiny risk of that. You've done it for that purpose. Right? And so those of you that will end up doing a career where you might have to prescribe, that's the lay of the land. And if you want the evidence on that, I'm happy to give you the evidence on that. And if you want to know, so what do I do? I'm Protestant. I think that artificial contraception is not best, but is permissible. And I'm a surgeon, and so I'm fairly risk tolerant. Right? I go to the OR and do things to people that have a tiny chance of killing them so that when they cough and sneeze, they don't leak urine. And they can stop buying pads. Right? So, which actually is a huge quality of life thing, but I'm risk tolerant. So I'm okay with with IUDs, but not post-coitally, when the purpose is to prevent implantation. And I have encountered Christian physicians on the whole range of the spectrum. And certainly I've encountered Christian physicians who, for various theological reasons, are fine preventing a fertilized egg from implanting. And I've even encountered Christian physicians who are fine to a certain gestational age, based on some rather obscure stuff in Leviticus, which we can get into if you're at all interested. I only have a few ethics jokes. One of them is here, that a Catholic and a Protestant and a rabbi were sitting around one day debating, and the priest said, well, you know, life begins. It doesn't really matter when life begins. It's not about when life begins. I don't know why we're talking about when life begins. And the priest and the Anglican minister says, well, I'm pretty sure that life begins at conception. And they're arguing for some time, and the rabbi is very quiet. And so they look over at the rabbi and say, what do you think? He leans back and says, I think life began when the kids left home and the dog died. Contraception. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that.
Geriatrics, not really.
Doesn't come up in geriatrics much, no.
I had a friend who was very much, she's Protestant, but was convicted of the Catholic position. And so then she was giving me all sorts of literature. And so there was a time I didn't prescribe birth control because I wasn't sure. And there's a Randy Alcorn book. I don't know if anyone's seen that. And so I was like, well, I should read this at some point because some people had been convinced by that they shouldn't prescribe birth control. But I had also done a lot of study about the, oh shoot, I'm going to forget the name, but basically the mucus method of natural family planning, what's the name of? Pardon? Billings method, yeah. So I've done a lot of study on that as well. So it's very important, the mucus. And so I read a bit of the Randy Alcorn book and kind of went, well, you could use these arguments to argue for contraception as well. And then we had a CMDS conference in New Brunswick in 2005, and there was a presentation about the Billings method, and I just kind of sat there and went, I think God's letting me prescribe birth control, because it was essentially saying how important the mucus is, and it changes because of the hormones. So then I was like, okay, I think I'm all right to do that. So
certainly in Protestant and Orthodoxy, it's kind of a matter of individual conscience, and has been my encounter. Yeah, and I'm happy to spend like the whole evening talking, because again, this is what I bread and butter. How do you spread the gospel to your patients in a way that is natural and not coercive or pushy? We've gotten into that a little bit already this evening. I don't know if you wanted to add any other thoughts as a panel.
Well, while you guys think. You look like you're both thinking. We've talked, well, some of you have been to the retreat when they had the saline solution, and that was I took that course a long while ago. So it's helpful, at least for putting up faith flags, and people then would know that you're a believer. And it depends on whether people are wanting to discuss those things. So to be open and to be putting up the faith flags and waiting to see whether they'll speak about it. And if you do have the opportunity to build relationship, and with the locums, I actually, because I've been in Wingham so many times, I'm starting to get to know different people. And it was interesting, I had one patient once, and she was saying that with her regular doctor, who is a Christian as well, she said, well, he always talks to me about being Christian. And I'm like, well, you've said you're a Christian. She's like, well, I know, but why does he have to talk to me about it? You never talk to me about it. And I'm like, well, we could talk about it. And then she's like, oh, and then we were talking about smoking cessation. And so I just asked her, well, have you prayed about it? And she said, well, yeah. And it's like, well, it's not a one-time thing. And then apparently she went back to work and said, well, everyone pray for me. And I'm like, oh, okay. But when she did come back another time when I was there, and we had a discussion a little bit again, but you just have to be where people are at. And I'm reading a book at present about talking about how with our culture, it's more of a relational evangelism, in a sense that you can share about how God has affected your life without necessarily saying you need to make a decision for Jesus right now, because that doesn't really work when people don't have the framework. We don't have people who've grown up in the church necessarily, and so that's just foreign language to them. So it's to use someone's phrase, which is not really what they were talking about, but it's more of a marathon rather than a sprint as far as sharing the gospel with people. So,
Patient-centered questions and patient-centered counseling never gets you into trouble, right? Self-centered everything gets you into trouble. Yeah. How can I become useful for mission work in developing countries? What specialties are best? What electives? So it's the same thing actually as rural practice, which is family medicine, general internal, general surgery, psychiatry, public health has been my experience. And in terms of electives, go do electives in rural places or in the developing world. If that's where you get the experience, is by going where the work is. Other thoughts?
I've been overseas as well, and I did an elective in medical school. I did an enrichment year, so I could go overseas. I did 14 weeks in South Africa. The first 4 weeks were in a big city, which was rather useless because there's way too many learners in a city, whichever part of the world you're in. At least in South Africa, maybe it would be different in a less developed country. But when I went to the rural hospital in South Africa, I got way more opportunity to be able to do things. And at points, I was running the pediatric ward after I'd learned how. Like, it wasn't like first week, okay, here, you take care of this. So thankfully, it wasn't quite like that. But there's lots of mission hospitals which are willing to take people on. And if you're willing to work, they're willing to take you often. So
We probably should put peds on that list.
yeah,
General
pediatrics,
peds.
definitely pediatrics.
And I left at OBGYN, didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
Oh. Yes.
That would be good too.
Neurosurgery, not so helpful.
But apparently they go.
Apparently they go,
Yeah.
but to develop capacity. And again, it depends on what you mean by developing world, right? I mean, if you're going to Nairobi, Kenya, that's different medicine than if you're going to rural Kenya, right? That certainly Nairobi has tertiary care, pretty much level facilities, and you can go do first world medicine in a third world situation. And the other thing that is happening more and more in medical missions is the concept that you go to build capacity rather than to replace capacity. So a lot of people are shifting from I'm going there to treat patients to I'm going there to teach physicians and nurses and community health workers, which is, I think, a very healthy and useful shift. So the more if you're looking to go to the developing world, you might want to do an elective or two in adult education and an elective or two in health administration. Because those are things you may also find yourself doing if you commit your life to developing country. They'll actually need you to be training doctors and building a healthcare system far more than they need you to treat patients.
I'll put in a quick plug for dentistry here. Of the two people that I know who've spent some time overseas, they both did that. One went to Mozambique to help set up dentistry for the country, and then the other person from our church is going to Papua New Guinea to do that. So yeah, build capacity rather than to replace capacity.
Can MedSend is an organization that CMDS birthed. It's now its own thing. And if you're looking at doing years of medical mission work, but you don't think you can go there because you need to pay off your debt first, Can MedSend has a fund that if you're saying going with Samaritan's Purse, they're not a sending organization, but if you want to go and do a long-term commitment, not a week or two, but a long-term commitment in the developing world, they are willing to assume the payments on your student loans while you're with a list of organizations that they can give you that they partner with. So you can go all the way from $500 to paying your loans. Yeah. Biggest regret in your life, and I think as maybe the Christian answer there would be the thing that you have had to remind yourself the most often that God has forgiven you for. It might be how. So when I read that question, biggest regret, I'm like, well, I don't have any regrets because Christ is forgiven, and regret in my mind is with guilt, and I don't really have guilt except for the things that I've done today and haven't got around to apologizing for, right? But they're not that big today. And the other thing when I read that question is, when I look back, the things that I wish I had done differently, I'm not so sure that God didn't direct or make use of. God can redeem anything, even our worst errors. So I'm having trouble coming up with an answer to that, so maybe I'll throw it over to you guys.
I've got something to say about that. We often think of regret in terms of the big one-time decisions that mark our path in life. We reached the fork in the road and we took this path rather than that path. But I found out, at least for me and a lot of the people that I know, the thing that affects quality of life the most is the day-to-day decisions that are there because of well-rehearsed propensities to choose in a particular direction. I'm talking about dependencies on things such as praise or status or wealth or getting one's way. These are the things that pressure us to keep doing the things that recycle us into patterns of stuck behavior. One of the greatest benefits of becoming a Christian is the freedom that attends that belief in following a Savior who's given himself. Sort of the goal of Christianity and sanctification is self-forgetful love. And there are things that I did in my youth that make it hard for me to do that now. I wish I could have planted the seeds earlier on how to live without things, certain things, like the aforementioned list. And I think those are the things. There are very few big one-time decision regrets. There are many little scattered patterns that have been laid down. So it's not now, what is it? I'll add one more thing to that. People usually think of sin as something that I do that really offends God, which is true. People rarely think of sin as something that I'm planting now that I will really regret that thing has gained strength in my life. I guess dentists are particularly familiar with this because it's not the cavities. You know what it is, Larry? It's the getting hooked on sugar.
In the first place.
That's what does it.
I was reminded of something lately, and it's not really important, the details of it, but it was before medical school, I had something that I lied, but I didn't actually lie, but I thought I was lying. And it took me a while to work through that, and it was the mercy of God to reveal to me that, right, I hadn't actually lied even though I thought I had, but it was a good conviction of, all right, I was ready to lie for something, to gain something for myself, and it just showed me how much I needed Jesus, and I'm always going to need Jesus because there's always going to be the temptation to self-preservation, and that's essentially why I did what I did. And I'm still working through, it was brought up again lately, and I'm not sure if God's pushing me to talk to someone about it because I'm not sure if I was a bad witness for Christ because that person knew that I thought I was lying even though I wasn't lying, and he knew I wasn't lying. So it's just a lot of mind games in a sense, but it is. That's the biggest. That's when that question comes up. It's like, yeah, that's probably the biggest thing, and I know I had to work through that, and I'm thankful that God showed me that I didn't actually lie, but I was willing to, and that's the part that just shows you that I'm not better than anybody else, and I am just as big a sinner as everybody else. But it also reminds you how much Jesus has done, and that there is forgiveness, and that's just a huge, huge gift.
I think that there's a few approaches to this as an issue. One is the thing that you have done that you regret. Did you let it just remain a regret, or did you try to use it to change yourself, or to make? And I'm not referring to you in any way.
Sure.
It's just
Sorry.
I'm not targeting anyone. It's just I mean as to help it change you so that you make sure that that either it doesn't happen again, or that you use it as a point that you always remind yourself, so that you don't fall into patterns as well. And another thing is, because during my studies in medicine, I was put in situations where I kind of used semantics to get out of problems, such as when they asked me to tell a patient that they needed this test. I knew full well that my staff doctor was wrong and that they shouldn't get this test. And the patient asked me, should I get this test? I said, well, I'm not your doctor. I cannot choose this. You have to discuss it with a staff doctor who thinks you should do it. But I thought that I hated it. I even argued with my staff doctor about it before seeing the patient. And the staff doctor asked me to persuade the patient they needed this. So what I did is I actually told them, I actually shifted back towards the staff doctor, but I still regret the fact I didn't say, no, look, this specialist said you don't need that test, and for this other reason, you really don't need it. Because the staff doctor I spoke to admitted that the test wouldn't give them anything, they were just curious about it. And this was pediatric CT scan of the head. And so I felt really horrible in this situation. I even wrote to the school when I finished graduating, but I regret not having told them at the time, because I know that it can increase the risk of brain cancer in the child, can increase the risk of leukemia. But as a medical student, I really didn't know what to do, and I felt very uncomfortable about it. And that's why I kind of used semantics to get around it, but I think I should have been more direct, and I do regret that, which is why I make sure that now that I'm not in this situation like that, I'm always very direct. And to those who are going through situations like this, I tell them, don't go to your university, go to the college. They have people to deal with this, because the university, sometimes there will be some backstabbing and there will be inappropriate approaches that will cause a lot of problems for you and the patient as well. So you should know who to go to, because the universities do not want you going to the college because they want to shove it under the rug. So this is something that I do regret, but I don't know how I know now what I would do, but at the time it was such a surprise. I even argued about it, which wasn't really good for my evaluation either, but you're stuck with those memories.
To move from something heavy to something light, which I think is a great way to end the first half. What's the funniest or most obscure thing you've seen in your practice? So I think it's an excuse for each of us to share a humorous story. And the one that comes to my mind right away is that certainly part of being in rural practice is that everybody sort of knows what you do, and I have to be very careful around confidentiality because of that. But generally, if somebody in my church community has a baby and I'm involved, I'll say at some point, I'm going to get asked, about this because people are going to hear that I was involved. Is it okay if I tell people, that I was here and that everything went really well? So I get the patient's permission to divulge the fact that I was there for her delivery. So there was a baby being dedicated, and one of the little old ladies, and the little old ladies, right? The hair is white, almost purple. The little old ladies leans over to me as this baby's being dedicated and says, "So did you deliver that one, dear?" And I said, yes, ma'am, I did. She said, "Oh, that's so nice. You're getting to know all the ladies of the church, one wahoo at a time." And what do? She's a little, one wahoo at a time. Wahoo, yes. But she's a little old lady, right? And I think that some of those little old ladies know they can get away with that. So, yes. What do you say, right? She's 80, so you just smile and nod, right? And again, you don't know whether she's like, if she gets it or not, and I think some of them do, but they know they can get away with it. So, other stories.
Okay, Dennis used these shade guides to match the teeth, and people are forever taking these shade guides and passing them on to the lab, and then they get lost and they mixed up, and you're missing a few, and you can't really use the set. So my favorite shade guide had a tab that's missing in action somewhere, and it really, one of those things that bugged me, because then you got to buy the whole set again. So I was looking around for it, and where did it go? And it just went missing for a while, and then one day it appeared again, and I said, hey, where did this come from? And my colleague said, you never imagined the story. So I did the shade matching on the patient, and she comes back the next week and she said, look what I found, it's stuck in my brassiere.
I can think of one story, but I feel like we're all in the same vein. But I get words mixed up sometimes. And I was doing a history on this lady. And so we were going through her past medical history and what surgery she's had done. And so you've had bilateral vasectomies. And I was like, she just looked at me. It's like, right, sorry, mastectomy. Okay, right. But she gave me a hug when she left because she thought it was so funny. So, yeah.
Let's take 10 minutes, and then we'll be back on the couch. So add 10 minutes to your watch, and we'll be back.